The ballroom at Ashworth House blazed with 1,000 candles, their flames reflected infinitely in the gilded mirrors that lined the walls, creating the illusion that London itself had been distilled into this single glittering space where the cream of society gathered on this warm June evening in 1815. The orchestra played a waltz, the strings sweet and melancholic beneath the brighter notes of the flutes, and the scent of hothouse roses mingled with expensive perfumes and the particular aroma of beeswax and ambition that seemed to perfume every grand ball of the season. Lady Cordelia Ashworth stood near one of the tall windows overlooking the garden, her fan moving slowly before her face, not from heat but from the need to occupy her hands with something, anything, that might disguise the trembling she felt whenever she allowed her gaze to drift as it did now, despite her best intentions, across the crowded floor to where he stood. The Duke of Ravenscar. Even his name seemed carved from granite, cold and unyielding, much like the man himself, who stood in conversation with Lord Pemberton near the marble columns that framed the entrance to the card-room. He was tall, she observed, not for the first time, with dark hair touched with premature silver at the temples, and a face that might have been handsome had it ever softened into anything resembling warmth. His evening clothes were impeccable. Black coat fitted precisely across broad shoulders, white cravat tied with mathematical precision, every element of his appearance speaking of control, of a man who permitted neither disorder nor excess in any aspect of his existence. "They say he has never smiled," whispered Lady Hartwell, who had materialized at Cordelia's elbow with the supernatural ability possessed by all dedicated gossips to sense when their subject was under observation. "Not once, not even as a child. His late father was the same cold as the family seat up in Yorkshire. They say the Duke conducts his affairs with the same efficiency he brings to his duties at court, all ledgers and logic, no room for sentiment." Cordelia said nothing, only nodded with what she hoped was polite disinterest, though her heart performed its familiar, foolish acceleration. She had never spoken to the Duke of Ravenscar, had never been introduced. Moved as they did in overlapping but distinct social circles, his elevated by ancient title and vast fortune, hers respectable but modest, the product of minor nobility and diminishing estates. Yet she had noticed him, had watched him across dozens of ballrooms over 2 seasons, had observed the way he listened more than he spoke, the way his ice-grey eyes assessed everything with penetrating intelligence, the way he stood slightly apart even when surrounded by courtiers and sycophants. There was something in that isolation that called to something in her own careful heart, though she would never have named it aloud, this secret attraction to a man who seemed carved from winter itself, this impossible and entirely inappropriate fascination with the Duke, whom everyone agreed possessed no capacity for human warmth whatsoever. The evening proceeded, as all such evenings did, with the careful choreography of social ritual, until the moment when everything shattered like crystal dropped upon marble, sudden and irreversible, the destruction complete before the sound had fully registered. Cordelia had accepted a dance with Lord Ashford, a pleasant gentleman of her father's acquaintance, and had just returned to the refreshment room where she had left her reticule on a side table near the punch bowl, reaching for it without thought, when Lady Beatrice Thornwood's voice cut through the ambient conversation with the precision of a blade, loud enough to turn heads but pitched as though she meant to be discreet. "My dear Lady Cordelia, I believe you've dropped something. How careless, when the contents might be so very sensitive." Cordelia turned, confused, to find Lady Beatrice holding a folded paper, her expression a perfect mask of concern that didn't quite conceal the gleam of something harder beneath. And before Cordelia could respond, before she could reach for the paper or ask what Lady Beatrice meant, Lord Thornwood, Beatrice's brother, a man whose loyalties during the recent war had been questioned more than once, snatched the letter from his sister's hand and unfolded it with theatrical shock. "Good God," he said, his voice carrying to every corner of the now silent room. "This is correspondence regarding troop movements, written in French, and it was in Lady Cordelia's reticule." The room erupted in gasps and whispers, the sound like wind through winter branches, and Cordelia felt the floor tilt beneath her feet, felt her breath catch in her throat as she tried to form words of denial, of explanation, but her voice emerged small and ineffective against the rising tide of scandal. "That isn't mine. I've never seen," but Lord Thornwood was already calling for the Duke of Ravenscar, who served as the King's principal advisor on matters of security and treason, and the crowd parted as the Duke strode forward, his face carved from ice, his grey eyes fixed on Cordelia with an intensity that paralyzed her, even as it made her heart pound with that same foolish, hopeless feeling she had nursed in secret for so long. He took the letter from Lord Thornwood, read it with methodical precision while the entire assembly held its collective breath, and when he looked up, his gaze found Cordelia's across the space between them, and she saw no warmth there, no question, no doubt, only cold certainty. "Lady Cordelia Ashworth," he said, his voice carrying the weight of absolute authority, each word falling like a stone into still water, creating ripples that would spread far beyond this single evening. "You stand accused of carrying correspondence that threatens the security of the crown, of conspiring with those who would undermine the peace so recently won at such terrible cost." She tried to speak, tried to defend herself, but he continued, implacable as winter. "The evidence is clear, found in your own possession, written in your own hand. If the initial C on the signature is any indication, it isn't my hand, Your Grace. I swear I have never." But her protest died as she saw his expression harden further, saw the absolute conviction in his face that she was guilty, that she was exactly what the evidence suggested, and she understood with devastating clarity that he had judged her already, had condemned her without trial, without question, without mercy. "You will leave London immediately," the Duke pronounced, his voice final as a door closing, as a tomb sealing. "By order of your king, and for the security of this realm, you are banished from society until such time as this matter can be properly investigated, though I suspect the investigation will only confirm what is already evident, your guilt." The ballroom spun around her, faces blurring into a mass of shock and avid curiosity and barely concealed satisfaction at witnessing such a spectacular fall, and Cordelia felt something break inside her chest, not just the terror of false accusation, but the sharper pain of betrayal, that he, the man she had secretly watched, had foolishly admired from afar, had become her harshest judge, had condemned her without even the courtesy of doubt. The journey north to Northumberland began the morning after her banishment, before dawn had fully broken over London, as though even the city wished to expel her under cover of darkness, and Cordelia sat in her family's travel-worn carriage with her maid Margaret beside her, silent and pale, while the streets gave way to countryside and the sky opened up grey and weeping, rain drumming against the roof with relentless monotony that matched the rhythm of her shattered heart. The roads were autumn-sodden, transformed to rivers of mud that sucked at the wheels and slowed their progress to a crawl, each mile taking an eternity, each inn where they stopped for the night offering only thin comfort cold rooms, curious stares from other travellers who had perhaps heard whispers of scandal, the weight of disgrace following her like a shadow she could not outrun. She did not sleep, could not silence the echo of his voice pronouncing her guilt, could not stop seeing the cold certainty in those grey eyes she had once foolishly thought beautiful, and the betrayal cut deeper than the false accusation itself, because she had nursed a secret tenderness for the Duke of Ravenscar, had watched him across ballrooms, and imagined, in her most private thoughts, what it might be like if he ever truly saw her, ever spoke to her with something other than distant courtesy, and now he had seen her, had spoken, and his words had been condemnation. 4 days the journey took, 4 days of rain and mud and the grinding ache of despair, until finally the carriage turned up the overgrown drive to Ashworth Manor, and Cordelia looked upon her family's estate with eyes that had not seen it in 3 years, since she had left for her first London season, full of hope and innocent dreams. The house stood grey against a greyer sky, its stone walls spotted with moss, several windows on the upper floor boarded over where her father could not afford the repairs, the gardens wild and unkempt, the fountain in the courtyard dry and filled with dead leaves, a monument to diminished fortunes and fading gentility that perfectly matched the ruin of her own prospects. Her parents met her at the door, her mother's face creased with worry, and her father's expression carefully neutral in that way he had when disappointment threatened to overwhelm his natural affection, and though they embraced her, though they assured her they believed in her innocence, she could see the questions in their eyes, the fear of what this scandal meant for their family's already precarious position, the knowledge that her younger sister's chances of a decent match had just evaporated like morning mist. They installed her in her old room, where the furniture sat draped in holland covers and the air smelled of disuse. And after they had left her alone, after Margaret had unpacked her trunks and retreated to her own quarters, Cordelia stood at the window, looking out over the wild moors that stretched to the horizon, and she understood with terrible clarity that this was her life, now exile in this crumbling house at the edge of the world, cut off from everything she had known, condemned by a man she had secretly admired, her name destroyed, her future a bleak landscape of solitude and slow decay, and the grief of it was almost more than her heart could contain, a weight in her chest that made each breath an effort, each moment an exercise in surviving the next. Weeks passed in a blur of grey mornings and greyer afternoons, time marked not by social engagements or the turning of seasons in London's elegant parks, but by the daily routines of survival in a house that was slowly crumbling around its inhabitants, and Cordelia threw herself into the work of the estate with a desperation that bordered on frenzy, as though physical exhaustion might silence the voices in her head that whispered his words over and over, that replayed the moment of her public condemnation until she thought she might go mad from the repetition. She helped her mother preserve the last of the autumn harvest, her hands stained purple with berry juice. She mended linens that should have been replaced years ago. She walked the wind-swept moors until her legs ached and her cheeks burned from the cold, hoping the vast emptiness of the landscape might somehow absorb the vast emptiness she felt inside. And in the evenings she read by candlelight in the library, old volumes her grandfather had collected, histories and poetry and philosophy that offered temporary escape from the prison of her thoughts. But always the bitterness returned, settling over her like the mist that rolled across the moors each morning, and she found herself caught between rage at the injustice and a deeper, more painful anger at herself for having been foolish enough to nurture tender feelings for a man who had proven himself capable of such cold cruelty, who had judged her guilty without question, who had not even done her the courtesy of doubt. Meanwhile, in London, the Duke of Ravenscar resumed his duties with his characteristic precision, attending meetings at Whitehall, advising the king on matters of security and diplomacy, maintaining the careful order of his life with the same methodical discipline that had always defined him. Yet something had shifted in the foundations of his certainty, some small stone dislodged that threatened to bring down the entire structure of his conviction about the Ashworth case. It began as a whisper of unease during a meeting about other security matters, when he found himself thinking of the letter that had condemned Lady Cordelia, remembering the handwriting, the phrasing, and realizing with the sudden clarity of his trained mind that something about it had not aligned with the other documents he had seen, bearing her signature, the guest book at the ball, the dance card she had dropped, but he had been so certain of her guilt in the moment, had trusted the evidence presented by Lord Thornwood so completely that he had not paused to question these details until now, when they returned to haunt him with persistent insistence. He told no one of his doubts, maintained his usual impassive demeanor in public, but in private he began to investigate, quietly and methodically, requesting files from his office, reviewing testimony given by servants who had been present, comparing handwriting samples with the meticulous attention to detail that had made him invaluable to the Crown, and with each piece of evidence he examined, the whisper of unease grew louder, became a voice he could not silence, asking questions he had failed to ask in his rush to judgment, suggesting possibilities he had been too certain to consider, and his methodical mind, which prided itself on logic and reason, could not rest until he knew the truth, whatever that truth might reveal about his own failure. The breakthrough came on a cold November morning when the Duke sat alone in his private study with 3 documents spread before him on the mahogany desk: the incriminating letter that had condemned Lady Cordelia, a guest registry from a charitable event she had attended 6 months prior, and a note she had written to the hostess of the fatal ball declining an earlier invitation. And as he studied them, with the focused intensity that had made him invaluable to the Crown's intelligence operations, he saw what he had been too certain, too quick to judge, to notice before. The handwriting did not match, not in the slope of the letters, not in the formation of the capitals, not in the distinctive way. She crossed her T's with a slight upward flourish that appeared in her genuine correspondence, but was absent from the treasonous letter. And the realization struck him like a physical blow, stealing the breath from his lungs and sending ice through his veins, because if the handwriting did not match, then the entire foundation of the case against her crumbled to dust. He summoned the servants who had testified, beginning with Lady Hartworth's footman, who claimed to have seen Lady Cordelia receive a package from a known French sympathizer, and the Duke questioned him with the same methodical precision he applied to matters of state security, pressing on inconsistencies, asking for details the man could not provide, watching as the footman's confidence wavered and finally broke, the truth spilling out in a torrent of confession that Lord Thornwood had paid him £50 to provide false testimony, had coached him on what to say, had threatened his position if he refused. One by one, the threads of the case unraveled in the Duke's hands as he interviewed others who had been present that night, discovered payments made to witnesses, found discrepancies in the timeline that should have been obvious from the start, but which his certainty had blinded him to seeing, and with each revelation his sense of horror grew, not just at the conspiracy itself but at his own failure, his rush to judgment, his willingness to condemn without thorough investigation because the evidence had seemed so clear, and his position as the king's advisor on security matters demanded swift action against any hint of treason. His characteristic control, that iron composure that had defined him since his youth, began to crack under the weight of a guilt so profound it threatened to undo him completely, because he had not merely made an error in judgment, he had destroyed an innocent woman's life, had cast her into exile with his words, had shattered her reputation and her future with the same cold certainty he applied to authentic threats to the crown, and the knowledge that she now suffered in disgrace, while he moved through London society with honor and respect, was a poison that seeped into every thought, every breath, transforming his ordered world into something unbearable. He sat alone in his study as evening fell and the candles burned low, holding the evidence of her innocence in hands that trembled slightly, a tremor he would have considered weakness in another man, but which he now recognized as the physical manifestation of a conscience finally awakened to its own capacity for injustice, and he understood with terrible clarity that this was not a mistake that could be corrected with a simple apology or a quiet retraction, that he had set in motion a catastrophe that demanded nothing less than complete dedication to its remedy. Whatever the cost to his own standing, whatever sacrifice it required of him, because Lady Cordelia Ashworth was innocent, and he had been her destroyer, and that truth would haunt him until he found a way to make it right. Months later, as autumn arrived in Northumberland with its palette of gold and amber, transforming the moors into a landscape of unexpected beauty, Cordelia had found what could only be described as a fragile peace, a tentative accommodation with her exile that felt less like acceptance and more like exhaustion. The simple inability to sustain the intensity of her anger and grief indefinitely, and in the spaces left by those receding emotions, she discovered small pleasures she had never noticed before. The way morning mist settled in the valleys like spilled silk, the startled flight of grouse from the heather, the particular quality of light on autumn afternoons that turned everything golden and temporary. She had befriended Miss Eleanor Hartley, the vicar's sister, a woman of perhaps 30 years with intelligent eyes and a practical manner who seemed entirely uninterested in London gossip and concerned only with the welfare of the village. And through Eleanor's influence, Cordelia had begun teaching the village children to read 3 afternoons each week in the small schoolroom attached to the church, finding in their eager faces and stumbling progress through simple texts a purpose that had eluded her in the glittering ballrooms of London, where her only function had been to be ornamental, to smile and dance and say nothing of consequence. The work was humble but real, the children's progress measurable in a way that social success had never been, and she discovered she had a talent for patience, for explaining things multiple times without frustration, for celebrating small victories like young Thomas finally mastering the difference between B and de, or little Anne reading an entire sentence without help, and these moments, insignificant as they might seem to the grand world she had lost, became the foundation of her days, giving them structure and meaning. She still walked the moors most mornings, but the walks had changed in character, becoming less about outrunning her thoughts and more about genuine observation of the landscape's austere beauty. She learned to identify the calls of different birds, noticed the places where foxes denned, once spent an entire morning watching a vixen and her cubs play in a patch of sunlight near the garden wall, their russet fur bright against the grey stone, their complete absorption in the moment, a lesson in being present rather than trapped in memory or fear of the future. The melancholy had not left her entirely. It colored her days like watercolor wash on paper, subtle but pervasive, a gentle sadness that she had come to recognize as part of herself now, the permanent mark left by betrayal and exile. But it no longer consumed her, no longer prevented her from noticing beauty or finding satisfaction in small accomplishments. She had come to believe, with a conviction that felt like resignation, that she would never return to London, that this quiet life of teaching and walking and reading by candlelight was her future now, and she worked to accept this fate, not with bitterness, but with the kind of grace her mother had always tried to teach her, the ability to bear what must be borne without complaint, to find dignity in reduced circumstances, to build something worthwhile from the ruins of what might have been. And if sometimes in the evenings she still thought of the Duke, still felt the sharp pain of his betrayal, she had at least learned to set those thoughts aside, to refuse them the power to undo the fragile peace she had constructed from the wreckage of her former life. The final piece of the conspiracy revealed itself on a December morning when the Duke's investigator brought him a sealed letter discovered in Lord Thornwood's private correspondence, a letter written in Lady Beatrice Thornwood's distinctive hand, detailing the entire plot with such casual malice that reading it made the Duke's blood run cold. She had envied Cordelia's beauty and her easy place in society, had resented the attention gentlemen paid her, and when her brother mentioned needing a scapegoat to divert attention from his own treasonous activities, Lady Beatrice had seen an opportunity to destroy her rival while protecting her family, had forged the incriminating correspondence herself after studying samples of Cordelia's handwriting obtained from mutual acquaintances, had planted the evidence in Cordelia's reticule during the ball with the help of a paid servant, and had orchestrated the entire revelation to occur in the most public and damaging manner possible, knowing that the Duke's position would require him to act swiftly and decisively against any hint of treason. The evidence was irrefutable, documented in Lady Beatrice's own words, with dates and details that corroborated everything the Duke had already discovered, and as he sat in his study with the letter before him, he felt a fury unlike anything he had experienced before, cold and absolute, the kind of rage that bypassed heated emotion and went straight to a glacial determination to see justice done. But beneath that fury was something deeper and more terrible, a horror at his own complicity, at how easily he had been manipulated, how his certainty and his position and his pride had made him the perfect instrument of an innocent woman's destruction, because Lady Beatrice had understood him well enough to know that the Duke of Ravenscar, once convinced of a threat to the crown, would show no mercy, would not hesitate, would bring down his judgment with all the weight of his authority and his absolute conviction. He ordered the arrests immediately, watching with grim satisfaction as Lady Beatrice was taken from her townhouse, still in her mourning dress, her face pale with shock that her crime had been discovered, and as Lord Thornwood was seized at his club and led away in chains, while his former friends watched in stunned silence. But even as he ensured that Cordelia's accusers would face the full consequences of their conspiracy, the Duke understood with painful clarity that arresting the guilty parties was the simplest part of what must be done, that his greater task, the one that would require every ounce of his will and influence and political capital, was to convince the king to pardon Lady Cordelia and restore her name, because a royal condemnation could only be undone by royal decree, and King George was not a man who enjoyed admitting error or reversing his judgments, particularly in matters that touched on security and treason. The Duke began preparing his case that very afternoon, assembling every piece of evidence, every witness recantation, every proof of Cordelia's innocence and of the conspiracy against her, working through the night with a focus that his secretaries had never witnessed before, because he understood that this was not merely about correcting a legal error, this was about restoring a life he had destroyed, about somehow making amends for an injustice he had authored. And though he did not yet allow himself to examine too closely why this particular case had become his consuming obsession, why the image of Lady Cordelia's face, as he condemned her, haunted his sleep and invaded his waking thoughts, he knew with absolute certainty that he would sacrifice whatever was necessary, spend whatever political capital he had accumulated, risk his own position and reputation if required, to bring her home from exile and return to her what he had taken away, because the guilt that had taken root in him during his investigation had grown into something that demanded nothing less than complete dedication to her restoration, whatever the cost to himself. The Duke requested his first audience with King George 3 days after ordering the arrests, appearing in the royal chambers with his evidence meticulously organized and his arguments carefully prepared, but he found himself facing a monarch who was less concerned with justice than with the appearance of infallibility. And as he laid out the proof of Lady Cordelia's innocence, the handwriting analysis, the witness recantations, Lady Beatrice's own damning correspondence, the king listened with an expression that grew increasingly uncomfortable, shifting in his ornate chair as if the truth itself were physically distressing, before finally raising one beringed hand to halt the Duke's presentation and saying in a tone that brooked no disagreement, "The matter is complicated, Ravenscar, more complicated than you perhaps appreciate, for to reverse our judgment now would be to admit error in a matter of treason, and at a time when Bonaparte's supporters still lurk in every shadow, when the peace is barely 2 years old and fragile as spring ice. We cannot afford to appear uncertain or weak in our prosecution of those who threaten the realm." The Duke, who had expected resistance but not this particular form of it, felt something shift inside him, the careful political calculations he had prepared giving way to a more visceral response, and he argued with a passion that surprised even himself, his voice rising slightly as he insisted that justice demanded correction regardless of political inconvenience, that an innocent woman had suffered exile and disgrace while the true conspirators had walked free, that the Crown's authority rested not merely on the appearance of strength but on the reality of fairness, and he watched the king's face darken at this barely veiled criticism, saw the courtiers who lined the walls exchange glances of shock because the Duke of Ravenscar did not speak with passion, did not allow emotion to color his counsel, was known throughout the court for his icy logic and his absolute control. The king denied his request with finality, standing to indicate the audience was concluded, saying that while he appreciated the Duke's diligence in uncovering the conspiracy, the matter of Lady Cordelia's pardon required further consideration, political consultation, a more opportune moment, and the Duke left the royal presence with his jaw clenched and his evidence still clutched in his hands, knowing he had failed, but utterly unwilling to accept that failure as permanent. He returned the next day, and the day after that, requesting audiences with a persistence that began to raise eyebrows among the court officials, presenting additional evidence, new arguments, approaching the matter from different angles, the injustice to an ancient family, the precedent it set for false accusations, the moral obligation of the Crown to protect the innocent, and each time the king grew more irritated, his refusals more curt, until finally he instructed his chamberlain to inform the Duke that no further audiences on this matter would be granted until His Majesty himself indicated readiness to discuss it. But the Duke did not stop. He simply changed tactics, appearing at court functions where the king would be present, mentioning the case in contexts that made it impossible to ignore, enlisting the support of other peers who had known Cordelia's family, creating a quiet drumbeat of voices, asking when justice would be served, and within a fortnight the whispers had begun, courtiers speculating in alcoves and antechambers about the Duke's unprecedented obsession with this particular case, wondering aloud what could drive the coldest man in London to such passionate advocacy, some suggesting he had formed an attachment to Lady Cordelia, others theorizing about political motivations no one could quite identify, but all agreeing that the Duke of Ravenscar was behaving in a manner no one had witnessed before, sacrificing his reputation for measured judgment in pursuit of a single goal that seemed to consume him entirely. The Duke's campaign became the talk of London, as January brought bitter cold and a determination in him that bordered on recklessness, for he began enlisting allies with the systematic precision he had once applied to matters of state security, calling upon every peer who had known the Ashworth family, every nobleman who had danced with Cordelia at her debut, every matron who remembered her mother's grace and her father's honor, and he did not merely ask for their support but presented them with the evidence of her innocence in private meetings that often lasted hours, his voice steady and relentless as he walked them through every detail of the conspiracy until they could not help but see the injustice that had been done. And one by one, they agreed to speak on her behalf, to mention her case in the king's hearing, to add their voices to his in calling for her restoration. But the Duke understood that private advocacy would not be sufficient, that public opinion must shift if the king was to feel pressure to act. And so he took the extraordinary step of arranging for a carefully worded article to appear in the Morning Chronicle, an essay that never mentioned Lady Cordelia by name, but spoke in general terms about the danger of false accusations and the Crown's sacred duty to correct errors when new evidence came to light. And though the piece never directly challenged the king's judgment, its implications were clear enough that every reader in London knew precisely which case it referenced, and the drawing rooms buzzed with speculation about who had commissioned such a bold publication, though those who knew the Duke's methodical mind recognized his hand in every precisely chosen phrase. His political capital, accumulated over years of faithful service and careful cultivation of alliances, began to deplete with alarming speed, for his obsession with this single case caused him to neglect other matters, to spend his influence on Cordelia's restoration rather than on the various petitions and proposals that normally occupied his attention. And his advisers came to him one evening in his study, 3 men who had served his family for decades, and they spoke with unusual frankness about the danger he courted, warning that he risked his own standing at court, that the king's patience was not infinite, that he was becoming known not for his judgment but for his strange fixation, and they asked him gently, because they respected him, whether any cause was worth the destruction of everything he had built. The Duke listened to them in silence, his fingers steepled before his face in a gesture they recognized as deep contemplation, and when they finished, he remained quiet for so long they thought he might not answer at all, but finally he spoke, his voice low and rough, with an emotion he had never before shown them. "I condemned an innocent woman without truly investigating, without questioning, without mercy, because I was so certain of my own judgment that I could not imagine being wrong, and she has spent months in exile, paying for my failure, for my pride, for my absolute conviction that I could not err in matters of such importance." He looked up at them then, and they saw something in his face that shocked them, not anger or frustration, but a kind of desolate recognition, as he continued, "This is no longer merely about correcting a legal error or restoring a reputation, though those things matter. This has become about atonement for a sin I did not know I was capable of committing, and I will spend whatever is necessary, sacrifice whatever is required, because the alternative is to live with the knowledge that I destroyed an innocent life and did nothing to repair it, and that, gentlemen, is a cost I cannot bear." Winter approached Northumberland with the slow inevitability of judgment deferred, bringing shorter days and frost that etched crystalline patterns on the windows of Ashworth Manor, and Cordelia had settled into the rhythm of her exile with a resignation that felt almost like peace, teaching her small class of village children their letters each morning, walking the frozen moors each afternoon, reading by the fire each evening, while her mother embroidered and her father dozed in his chair, until the day in late January when the post brought a letter from her cousin Thomasina in London, and Cordelia opened it expecting the usual benign gossip about parties she would never attend and fashions she would never wear, but instead found herself reading a strange account of the Duke of Ravenscar, appearing repeatedly at court to argue for her pardon, of him enlisting noblemen to speak on her behalf, of whispered speculation about his unprecedented obsession with her case. She read the passage 3 times, certain she must be misunderstanding, for why would the man who had condemned her with such cold finality now fight for her restoration? And her first reaction was disbelief edged with bitter humor. Surely Thomasina had confused the details, had attributed to the Duke actions that belonged to some other nobleman, perhaps someone who had actually known her, actually cared whether she rotted in the north or reclaimed her place in society. But a week later another letter arrived, this time from a school friend who wrote with barely contained excitement that the Duke had published something in the Morning Chronicle that everyone knew was about Cordelia's case, that all of London was talking about his determination to see her vindicated, and Cordelia felt something crack in the careful shell she had built around her heart. Not hope exactly, for she refused to allow herself that dangerous luxury, but a terrible curiosity that kept her awake at night, wondering what could possibly motivate such efforts. More letters came as February began, each one adding details to the portrait of the Duke's campaign. He had quarrelled with the king, risked his own standing, spent his political influence as if it meant nothing compared to securing her pardon, and Cordelia found herself in a state of emotional confusion that left her pacing her small room at odd hours, anger warring with bewilderment, because the man who had destroyed her life with a few cutting words was now apparently sacrificing everything to restore it, and she could not comprehend why, could not make the two images reconcile in her mind. She tried to discuss it with her mother, who said gently that perhaps the Duke had discovered his error and was doing what honor demanded. But Cordelia knew that men of the Duke's position did not risk the king's displeasure merely to correct administrative mistakes, did not deplete years of accumulated influence for abstract principles of justice, and so some other explanation must exist, some motivation she could not identify, and the not knowing gnawed at her like hunger, made her read and reread each letter, searching for clues to his thinking, to his heart, if indeed he possessed such an organ beneath that icy exterior. She told herself firmly that she would not hope, would not allow herself to imagine that his efforts meant anything beyond a powerful man's determination to right a wrong he had committed, would certainly not permit herself to wonder whether he thought of her as anything more than a case to be resolved, a problem to be solved with the same methodical precision he apparently applied to all matters of state. And yet she found herself standing at her window watching the frozen road as if riders might appear at any moment with news from London. Found herself listening for the post with an eagerness that shamed her, found herself remembering against her will the way he had looked across the ballroom before everything shattered, and hating herself for remembering, for caring, for allowing even the smallest crack to form in the armor of indifference she had worked so hard to forge around the ruins of her heart. The Duke requested a private audience with the king on a cold February morning when fog still clung to the Thames and the palace corridors echoed with unusual quiet, and he arrived with none of his customary composure, his jaw set in a line that his valet had never seen before, his eyes burning with a determination that bordered on recklessness, for he knew he was about to risk everything he had built over years of patient service, every alliance he had cultivated, every ounce of influence he had accumulated, and he would do it gladly if it meant finally securing Cordelia's restoration. The king received him in the small receiving room, where matters of delicate importance were discussed away from the curious ears of courtiers, and His Majesty's expression held weariness and irritation in equal measure, for the Duke's persistence had become exhausting, his repeated petitions a source of tension that the king resented, and before the monarch could speak, the Duke began with words he had rehearsed 100 times, yet still felt inadequate. "Your Majesty, I have served the crown faithfully for 15 years, as my father served before me and his father before him, and I have never asked for personal favor or placed my own interests above those of the realm, but I stand before you now prepared to stake everything on this single request. Lady Cordelia Ashworth must be pardoned and her name restored, for the evidence of her innocence is irrefutable, and the injustice done to her, a stain that grows darker with each day, we fail to correct it." The king's face darkened at this opening, for the Duke's tone carried an edge that approached insubordination, and he replied coldly that the matter had been discussed repeatedly, that political considerations must be weighed against individual cases, that the crown could not appear to reverse its judgments without compelling reason, but the Duke did not retreat as he always had before, did not bow and withdraw to regroup for another attempt, instead stepping forward with a boldness that made the guards at the door straighten in alarm and saying with quiet intensity, "Then I must inform your Majesty that if Lady Ashworth is not pardoned, I will resign every position I hold in your service. I will withdraw my family's support from the crown in all matters, both public and private, and I will stand before Parliament and detail every piece of evidence that proves her innocence and condemns those who conspired against her, and if that constitutes treason, then I will accept whatever punishment your Majesty deems appropriate, for I will not remain silent while an innocent woman suffers for my failure to investigate properly before condemning her." The silence that followed was absolute, terrible, crackling with a tension that seemed to draw all air from the room, and the king stared at him with an expression of profound shock. For no nobleman had spoken to him thus in decades, no adviser had threatened such open defiance, and the Duke held his gaze without wavering, his heart hammering but his face composed, knowing he had crossed a line from which there could be no retreat, that he had just destroyed his career and possibly his freedom, but finding in that destruction a strange liberation, a rightness that steadied his voice as the king finally spoke with dangerous softness, Why does this case matter so much to you, Ravenscar? Of all the injustices in the realm, all the falsely accused and wrongly condemned, why has this particular woman become your obsession? And the Duke discovered that he had no prepared answer for this question, no careful political response, and what emerged instead was raw truth that surprised even himself. Because I was wrong, Your Majesty, and I must make it right. The king's expression shifted through several emotions in the space of a heartbeat: surprise, calculation, something that might have been reluctant respect, and then he leaned back in his chair with the weariness of a man who has finally been bested, and said quietly, "You would truly throw everything away for this? Ravenscar, your position, your family's legacy, your entire future, for a woman you have never even properly spoken to?" And it was not quite a question, but the Duke answered anyway with simple honesty. "I would, Your Majesty, because some things matter more than position or legacy, and making right what I made wrong is one of them." And the king studied him for a long moment before nodding slowly and saying, "Very well, I will grant the pardon, but there are conditions. Lady Ashworth must be formally presented to court again, her reputation publicly restored through my personal acknowledgement before the entire assembly, and you, Ravenscar, must sponsor her return personally, must stand beside her as she is vindicated, so that all of London sees that the man who condemned her now vouches for her innocence. Do you accept these terms?" The Duke felt relief crash through him like a wave breaking against cliffs, so powerful it nearly buckled his knees, but he kept his voice steady as he bowed and said, "I accept with profound gratitude, Your Majesty." And the king waved a hand in dismissal, already calling for his secretary to prepare the necessary documents, a royal proclamation that would be read in the House of Lords and published in every newspaper, an official declaration of Lady Cordelia Ashworth's complete innocence and the Crown's recognition of the grave injustice done to her. The Duke left the palace in a state of barely contained urgency, his mind already racing ahead to everything that must be done, and within the hour he had dispatched his 2 fastest riders north to Northumberland, carrying the official pardon and a personal letter he had written in his own hand, his usually impeccable penmanship slightly unsteady as he tried to find words adequate to the occasion, and failed. For how could he possibly express in mere sentences the transformation of the past months, the horror of his realization, the consuming necessity of making amends? So instead he wrote with formal restraint that masked deeper feeling, informing Lady Ashworth of the king's pardon and the arrangements for her restoration, requesting, not demanding, for he had no right to demand anything of her ever again, that she return to London to reclaim her rightful place in society. And he signed it simply with his name, no elaborate closing, no presumption of familiarity, though his hand lingered over the paper as if reluctant to send it, as if once it left his possession he would have no control over her response, no way to ensure she would actually come, for the terrible possibility existed that she might refuse, might decide that she preferred her exile to the ordeal of facing London again, preferred the peace of the North to the scrutiny that would inevitably accompany her return. And if she refused, he would have no recourse, could not compel her, would have to accept that his atonement remained forever incomplete. He sealed the letter with his signet ring, the wax blood-red in the firelight, and handed it to the waiting rider with instructions to deliver it directly into Lady Ashworth's hands and to wait for a response, to assure her that every arrangement would be made for her comfort and convenience, that she need not fear any difficulty or obstacle, for he would ensure that her path back to London was smooth in every particular, though he could not ensure that she would choose to travel it, could not control whether she would grant him the opportunity to stand beside her and publicly acknowledge his terrible error. And as he watched the riders disappear into the February twilight, he felt fear unlike any he had known in battle or politics, the fear that she might choose to remain in exile rather than face him again, that his efforts might have come too late to matter, that some wounds, once inflicted, could never truly heal. The Duke's letter arrived at Ashworth Manor on a late February afternoon, when thin sunlight struggled through pewter clouds and the last remnants of winter snow clung stubbornly to the shadowed hollows of the moors, and Cordelia received it in the small drawing-room where she had been attempting to read, though her mind had wandered repeatedly from the page, and when the servant announced that a royal messenger awaited her response, her heart began to hammer with a force that frightened her, for she knew, before breaking the seal, that everything was about to change again, that the fragile peace she had constructed over months of exile was about to shatter like ice beneath an unexpected thaw. She dismissed the servant and sat alone with the letter for several minutes before opening it, her fingers trembling slightly as she traced the Duke's seal pressed into scarlet wax. And when she finally broke it and unfolded the heavy paper, she found his handwriting strong, precise, yet somehow less controlled than she would have expected, and she read the formal words that informed her of the king's pardon, of the arrangements for her restoration, of his request that she return to London, and beneath the careful phrasing, she detected something she had not anticipated: genuine contrition, a thread of uncertainty, an acknowledgement of the enormity of what had been done to her that felt more real than any elaborate apology could have been. She read the letter 3 times, then 4, searching for hidden meanings in every phrase, trying to understand what he truly felt beyond the constraints of formal correspondence. And each reading revealed new nuances the way he requested, rather than commanded, her return. The careful assurance that every arrangement would be made for her comfort, the absence of any presumption that she owed him gratitude or compliance, and most telling of all, the simple signature without elaborate closing, as if he had no right to claim any familiarity or regard, as if he understood that he had forfeited any such privilege when he condemned her without investigation. Her parents, when she showed them the letter, urged her immediate return with an enthusiasm born of relief and vindication, for her exile had been a shadow over the entire family, and her mother clasped her hands and spoke of restored reputation and reclaimed position, of everything they had lost suddenly returned. But Cordelia found herself unable to share their uncomplicated joy, for her emotions tangled into a knot she could not easily unravel. Justice had been served. Her name would be cleared, but the wound in her heart had not healed, and she feared that returning to London meant facing not just society's scrutiny, but also the man who had hurt her more deeply than all the rest combined. She walked the moors for hours that afternoon, her cloak whipping in the bitter wind, trying to decide what she truly wanted, and she realized that part of her wished to refuse, to send back a polite declination and remain in the north, where she had finally learned to breathe again, where no one's opinion could touch her, where she need never stand before the Duke and see in his eyes whatever complicated mixture of guilt and duty had motivated his extraordinary efforts on her behalf. Yet another part of her, the part she had thought broken beyond repair, whispered that she could not let fear make her decisions, that she had survived the worst already, that returning to London was not about him at all, but about reclaiming what had been stolen from her, proving to herself and the world that she would not remain defeated. And after 3 days of contemplation, she sat down and wrote her response, informing the Duke that she would return to London and accept the King's gracious pardon, her words carefully formal, revealing nothing of her inner turmoil. And as she sealed the letter, she felt terror and determination in equal measure. Knowing she was choosing the harder path, the one that required courage rather than retreat, and she whispered to herself in the empty room, "I return for myself, not for him, not for London, but to prove that I am not broken." And she sent the letter with the waiting messenger and began, with shaking hands, to prepare for the journey that would either restore her completely or destroy what little peace she had managed to salvage from the ruins of her former life. Cordelia's journey south began on a morning when pale winter sun broke through the northern clouds like a benediction, and as the fine carriage provided by the Duke, though she tried not to think of it as his gift, tried to see it merely as practical, necessity rolled away from Ashworth Manor. She felt the weight of the past months, lifting and settling simultaneously, for she was leaving behind the sanctuary that had sheltered her broken spirit, but also the prison that exile had created, and the contradictions of her emotions made her dizzy with their intensity. The journey that had taken her north in disgrace now reversed itself in something that resembled hope, though she hardly dared name it that, and where before there had been rain and muddy roads and her family's shabby coach with its cracked leather seats, now there was winter sunshine and well-maintained highways and cushioned comfort that felt almost decadent after months of rural simplicity. And she watched the landscape transform as they travelled, the wild moors giving way to gentler hills, the sparse northern villages becoming prosperous market towns, the isolation of Northumberland yielding mile by mile to the busy commerce of the south. And each landmark passed felt like a step toward confrontation, toward the ordeal that awaited her in London, toward the man whose letter she had read so many times she could recite it from memory, though she still could not decipher what lay beneath its formal courtesy. Her aunt's London townhouse welcomed her with warmth that surprised her, for Aunt Margaretta had written faithfully throughout her exile. But Cordelia had feared that even family loyalty might have limits. Yet her aunt embraced her fiercely and said with characteristic bluntness, "You should never have been sent away, child, and the entire business was a disgrace. But now we shall see you restored properly, and those who wronged you will learn that an Ashworth does not break so easily." And Cordelia felt tears prick her eyes at this fierce advocacy, at the reminder that she had not been entirely alone, even when exile made her feel abandoned by the world. The preparations for her formal presentation began immediately, and Cordelia found herself caught in a whirlwind of dressmakers and dancing masters and careful coaching on court protocol, for her aunt insisted that every detail must be perfect, that Cordelia must appear before the king and assembled court as the epitome of grace and dignity, must show them all that months of unjust exile had not diminished her. And as she stood for endless fittings and practiced her curtsy until her legs ached, Cordelia felt terror and determination warring within her, for she knew that when she walked into that throne room, she would face not just the king but the entire society that had watched her fall, and she would face the Duke, who had engineered both her destruction and her salvation, and she did not know which frightened her more. In quiet moments alone in her aunt's guest room, she examined her reflection in the mirror and saw changes that exile had wrought her face, perhaps a touch thinner, her eyes holding shadows they had not contained before, but also something new, something she had not possessed in her previous London season, a core of steel beneath the softness, a strength forged in solitude and suffering, and she thought to herself with wonder and pride, "I am not the woman who left London in disgrace. I am someone exile created, someone who survived what should have broken her, and they will see that I am not easily destroyed." And she drew on that strength as the day of her presentation approached, as her aunt's townhouse filled with flowers from well-wishers who had suddenly remembered their friendship now that the king himself had declared her innocent, as she prepared to step back into the world that had cast her out and prove that she had returned, not as a supplicant seeking their approval, but as a woman reclaiming what had always been rightfully hers. The Duke arrived at Cordelia's aunt's townhouse precisely at the appointed hour 3 days before her formal presentation, and when she descended the stairs to the drawing room, where he waited with her aunt serving as chaperone, she felt her breath catch in a way that infuriated her, for she had told herself during the long journey south that she would be composed, that months of exile had armored her heart against him, yet the sight of him standing by the window with afternoon light, casting his austere features into sharp relief, undid something in her carefully constructed defenses, and she forced herself to walk steadily across the room, though her hands trembled slightly in the folds of her gown. He turned as she entered, and for one unguarded moment she saw something raw flash across his face, relief, perhaps, or apprehension, or something more complicated than either before. His expression settled into the formal mask she remembered from that terrible night when he had condemned her before all of London, and he bowed with precise correctness and said, "Lady Cordelia, I am grateful you consented to see me," and his voice carried a roughness she had not heard before, as though even these simple words cost him effort. She curtsied with equal formality, her own voice cool and carefully controlled as she replied, "Your Grace, my aunt suggested the meeting would be appropriate given the arrangements for my presentation," and she deliberately framed it as obligation rather than choice, saw him absorb the small cruelty with a barely perceptible tightening of his jaw, and they sat in chairs. Her aunt had positioned at a respectable distance, while Margaretta settled near the fire with needlework that everyone knew was merely pretense of occupation while she chaperoned. The silence stretched awkwardly until the Duke spoke again, and his words came formal and rehearsed, as though he had prepared them carefully. "I must apologize for the grievous wrong I did you, Lady Cordelia. I condemned you without proper investigation, allowed my zeal for the king's security to override my duty to justice, and caused you suffering that no apology can adequately address, but I take full responsibility for my failure and hope that my efforts to restore your name demonstrate the sincerity of my regret." And though the words were stiff, carefully constructed, Cordelia heard beneath them genuine remorse, saw in the tension of his posture and the tightness around his eyes that this formal apology concealed deeper turbulence. She accepted with equal stiffness, saying, Your Grace's recognition of the error and his subsequent efforts on my behalf are appreciated. The king's pardon restores what was taken, and we need not dwell further on past difficulties." And even as she spoke the polite dismissal, she felt the inadequacy of it, for how could such formal words encompass the enormity of what had passed between them? Her exile, his obsessive quest for her vindication, the months of suffering and effort that could not be neatly contained in drawing-room courtesy. They spoke briefly of practical matters, the presentation ceremony, the arrangements that had been made, the king's conditions for her restoration. And throughout the conversation, Cordelia found herself noticing details she had never observed during those brief moments at balls before her banishment, when she had admired him from a distance. The weariness in his eyes that spoke of sleepless nights, the barely perceptible tension in his jaw that suggested his famous control was harder won than she had imagined, the way his hands clenched briefly when she used his title with particular coldness, and she realized with uncomfortable clarity that the Duke was not the ice-hearted aristocrat of reputation, but rather a man who held himself under rigid control, and that her case had somehow cracked that control, revealed something beneath that he perhaps had not known was there. When he rose to leave after the prescribed quarter hour, he paused and said with less formality, "I hope the presentation will not be too difficult an ordeal, Lady Cordelia. You have already endured far more than anyone should have to bear." And for just a moment their eyes met directly, and she saw in his gaze something that made her heart contract, despite her determination to remain unmoved, genuine, concern, profound guilt, and beneath both a question he did not dare voice, and she replied softly, "I have survived worse. Your Grace, I shall manage." And the words carried double meaning, a reminder that his condemnation had been the worst, that she had already survived what he had done to her, and she saw him absorb the rebuke before he bowed and departed, leaving her alone with her aunt and the unsettling realization that her anger toward him, which she had cultivated and relied upon during her exile, was more complicated than she wished it to be, for she had seen his remorse and found it genuine, had noticed his weariness and recognized it as the cost of his fight for her vindication, and she did not want to feel sympathy for the man who had destroyed her life, did not want to acknowledge that perhaps his atonement had been as painful as her exile, yet the truth of it lingered in the room long after he had gone. The throne room at St. James's Palace blazed with candlelight from 1,000 flames that seemed to mirror the intensity of all the eyes fixed upon Cordelia as she entered through the great doors on the appointed day, and she had dressed with meticulous care in a gown of pale silver silk that caught the light like moonlight on water, her dark hair arranged in the classical style her aunt had insisted upon, every detail of her appearance calculated to present not a woman pleading for restoration, but a lady who had never deserved to lose her place. And as she walked the endless length of carpet toward the dais where King George sat in state, she felt the weight of scrutiny from the assembled court, like a physical pressure against her skin, knew that every person in that glittering assembly was judging her, whispering behind fans and gloved hands, wondering if she would falter or weep, or show some sign of the weakness they expected from a woman who had endured months of exile and disgrace. She did not look for the Duke, though she knew he must be present somewhere among the king's closest advisers, refused to let her eyes search for him because she needed all her strength, focused on the ordeal before her, and when she reached the prescribed distance from the throne, she sank into the deep curtsy she had practiced until her legs ached, holding the position with perfect grace while the Lord Chamberlain read the formal acknowledgement of her presentation. And only when he finished did she rise and meet the king's eyes with a steadiness that surprised her, for she had expected to feel small before the sovereign who held her fate in his hands, but instead she felt the strength that exile had forged in her, the steel core that suffering had created. The king's voice rang through the chamber with formal authority as he declared, "Lady Cordelia Ashworth, having been subject to false accusation through the machinations of those who have since been brought to justice, is hereby restored to her rightful place in society, her innocence proclaimed before God and this court, and let it be known that those who conspired against her have been condemned for their treachery." And though the words were rehearsed, part of the ceremony that had been carefully arranged, Cordelia felt their power wash over her like absolution, felt the official weight of vindication settle around her shoulders like an invisible mantle, and she curtsied again, in acknowledgement, Her eyes pricking with tears, she refused to shed before this audience, who would interpret any emotion as weakness. It was only as she straightened from that second curtsy that she allowed herself to glance toward where the king's advisers stood, and she found the Duke immediately among them, his tall figure and austere features unmistakable even in the crowded assembly. And their eyes met across the distance of the throne room in a moment of connection that felt both brief and eternal. And she saw in his face not the careful neutrality she had expected, but rather something raw and unguarded. Relief so profound it bordered on pain, pride that she had carried herself with such grace, and beneath both emotions, something deeper that she could not name, but that made her breath catch, and her carefully maintained composure waver for just an instant before she looked away, breaking the connection because it threatened to undo her completely. The ceremony concluded with formal words and ritual gestures, and as Cordelia withdrew from the royal presence with the prescribed steps backward, never turning her back on the sovereign, she felt the atmosphere in the throne room shift palpably, felt the court's assessment change from judgment to acceptance, and before she had even reached the antechamber, where her aunt waited, the invitations began, whispered offers of attendance at balls and dinners, and musical evenings from people who had watched her fall, and now rushed to align themselves with her restoration. And though she accepted their suddenly renewed friendship with gracious politeness, she felt a cynical understanding of how quickly society's opinion could reverse, how her worth in their eyes depended not on her character, but on the king's favor, and she thought with bitter clarity that exile had taught her to see through the glittering surface of London society to the calculating machinery beneath, and she would never again mistake their approval for genuine regard. The weeks following Cordelia's presentation unfolded with the careful choreography of a minuet, each social engagement a step in the complicated dance of her restoration, and she moved through the glittering succession of balls and dinners and musicales with practiced grace, while privately marveling at how quickly London society had embraced her again, as though her months of exile had been merely an unfortunate intermission rather than a devastating rupture in her life. And through it all, she remained aware of the Duke's presence at the periphery of her restored world, always proper, always maintaining respectful distance, yet somehow always there when she glanced across a crowded ballroom or sat at a dinner table arranged by hostesses who seemed to unconsciously place them within sight of each other. She told herself she did not seek him out, that it was merely coincidence when her eyes found his tall figure among the crowds, but as the weeks accumulated, she began to notice patterns that were too consistent to be accidental. At Lady Ashford's ball, when her dance card had an unfortunate gap after a partner withdrew due to sudden illness, the Duke's cousin appeared to request the set with an apologetic explanation that Ravenscar had suggested he might partner her. At the Worthington dinner, when an elderly earl made a mildly inappropriate comment about her ordeal, she overheard the Duke speaking quietly to the man afterward, and the earl sought her out before departing to offer profuse apologies. When whispers began circulating about whether her family's estate could support her return to society, suddenly the Duke's particular friends were praising the Ashworth family's ancient lineage and respectable holdings to anyone who would listen, and the whispers died before they could take root. Cordelia understood with growing certainty that she was being protected, that someone was smoothing her path and eliminating obstacles before she even encountered them, and though the Duke never acknowledged these interventions, never approached her directly beyond the required courtesies at social functions, she knew with absolute conviction that he was the architect of her careful restoration, and the knowledge stirred something complicated in her chest. Gratitude, certainly, but also confusion about his motives and a reluctant softening of the anger she had held close like armor since her exile. Their actual encounters remained brief and scrupulously proper. A dance at the Pemberton ball where they moved through the figures of the quadrille with barely a dozen words exchanged, yet she was intensely aware of his hand at her waist during the turn, felt the strength in his touch and the careful restraint he exercised. A conversation at a gallery exhibition where they discussed a landscape painting of the northern moors, and she mentioned without thinking how much she had come to appreciate such vistas during her time in Northumberland, saw something flicker in his eyes' pain. Perhaps at the reminder of what he had cost her before, he said quietly that the North had a stark beauty that stayed with those who knew it. A moment at an intermission during the opera, when they stood on adjacent balconies overlooking the street, and he asked with genuine concern if she was managing well. if London society was treating her kindly, and she had answered honestly that yes, more kindly than she had expected, and she saw relief in his face before they were interrupted by other acquaintances. With each small encounter, the ice between them thawed incrementally, and Cordelia found herself thinking of him not as the cold judge who had condemned her, but as something more complex, a man capable of profound error, but also of equally profound atonement, someone whose rigid control concealed depths of feeling he perhaps did not know how to express, and she caught herself wanting to understand him better, wanting to know what lay beneath that austere exterior, and the realization both frightened and intrigued her, for she had not thought it possible to feel anything for him beyond anger and bitterness. Yet here, in the careful courtesy of his distance and the quiet protection of his unseen interventions, she sensed something that might, given time and courage, transform into forgiveness and perhaps into something more dangerous still. The Marchioness of Lindsay's winter garden party was held in the magnificent conservatory attached to her Mayfair residence, a glass palace filled with exotic plants that bloomed improbably in the February cold, while servants circulated with champagne and delicate pastries, and Cordelia had accepted the invitation because refusing would have seemed peculiar after weeks of careful social reintegration, though she found these afternoon gatherings tedious with their undercurrent of gossip masquerading as conversation, and she was standing near a cluster of orange trees discussing some inconsequential matter with the vicar's wife, when she heard the voice cut through the polite murmur of the party like a knife through silk. Of course, one must admire Lady Cordelia's resilience. Lady Margaret Fenwick was saying to a small group within Cordelia's hearing, her tone sugary with false sympathy, to return to society after such an ordeal, though I confess I should have thought the taint of accusation might have encouraged a more retired life, regardless of official pardon, for there are some whispers that can never be entirely silenced, are there not? Cordelia felt the words like a slap, felt the eyes of nearby guests slide toward her to gauge her reaction, and she drew breath to respond with the cool dignity she had practiced for precisely such moments when a voice of cold authority spoke from behind her, and she did not need to turn to know it was the Duke, though she did anyway, drawn by the lethal precision in his tone. "Lady Fenwick," he said, and the two words carried such weight that conversation throughout the conservatory faltered and died. "I was unaware that you had become an authority on moral character, given that your own associations include noted sympathizers of Lady Beatrice Thornwood, whose conspiracy against Lady Cordelia has been legally established and publicly condemned by His Majesty himself, and I find myself wondering whether your attempt to cast aspersion on a lady whom the Crown has vindicated speaks to ignorance or to a more troubling continuation of the malice that produced the original injustice." The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the distant sound of water dripping in one of the fountains, and Lady Fenwick's face drained of colour as she realised what had just occurred. The Duke of Ravenscar, whose social position was unassailable, had just publicly severed her from respectable society with surgical precision, and everyone present understood that his condemnation would be repeated in every drawing-room in London by nightfall. She attempted some stammered explanation, but the Duke simply turned his back on her in deliberate dismissal. The cut direct, performed with devastating formality, and within moments Lady Fenwick had fled the conservatory, while the other guests carefully avoided any acknowledgement of what they had witnessed, and Cordelia found herself trembling with an emotion she could not name. Gratitude, certainly, but also fury at needing to be defended. And beneath both feelings, a desperate need to understand why he would do this, what she meant to him, that he would wield his considerable power so publicly on her behalf. She did not consciously decide to follow when she saw him leave the conservatory through a side door that led to the winter garden beyond, did not plan the confrontation that came next, but she found herself stepping through the same door into the cold afternoon air where frost glittered on bare branches, and the Duke stood with his back to her, his shoulders rigid with tension, and when he heard her approach and turned, she saw in his face something raw and unguarded before his customary control reasserted itself. "Why?" she demanded without preamble, her voice shaking slightly despite her attempt at composure. "Why do you continue to fight my battles, to position yourself as my protector, when you were the one who destroyed me in the first place?" And she saw him flinch, as though her words were physical blows, saw something crack in that austere facade, and when he spoke, his voice carried a weight of emotion She had never heard from him before, rough and unsteady as he said, "Because when I investigated your case, Lady Cordelia, I discovered not merely your innocence, but your character. Every servant I interviewed spoke of your kindness. Every charitable institution listed your contributions. Every person who knew you described intelligence and compassion and grace. And I realized that I had condemned you without seeing you, without truly perceiving the woman before me. And when I finally did see you, it was too late. The damage was done, and I understood that I had destroyed something precious through my arrogance and haste." And he took a step toward her, his hands clenched at his sides as though he physically restrained himself from reaching for her, his eyes burning with intensity as he continued. "I did not fight the king for abstract justice, Lady Cordelia. I fought for you, because you deserved better than my judgment, better than exile, better than the pain I caused. And if I spend the rest of my life ensuring that no one ever hurts you again, it will not be sufficient atonement for what I have done." His words hung in the cold air between them, like a confession whispered in a cathedral, and Cordelia felt something break open inside her chest, not the clean snap of a branch, but the slow, terrible cracking of ice that had formed over deep water. And suddenly all the anger she had held so carefully contained came flooding out in a torrent she could not control. "You want to atone," she said, and her voice shook with the force of emotions too long suppressed. "You cannot imagine what you cost me, Your Grace. You cannot conceive of what it means to be torn from everything you know and cast out like refuse, to watch your parents' faces crumble with disappointment even as they professed belief in your innocence, to spend months in a crumbling house where every room reminded you of better days now lost, to walk the moors alone because you could not bear company and wonder if you would spend the rest of your life in that grey exile, forgotten by everyone who had once smiled at you in London's ballrooms." And she saw him flinch with each accusation, but she could not stop. The words coming faster now as tears she had refused to shed for months finally spilled down her cheeks. "I rebuilt myself from nothing, learned to find purpose in teaching village children and mending my own clothes and accepting that the life I had imagined was gone forever. And just when I had found some measure of peace, you dragged me back to face it all again. The society that condemned me, the scrutiny, the whispers, the knowing I would always be the woman who was accused regardless of official pardon," and her hands were trembling as she pressed them against her chest, where her heart hammered painfully, and she forced herself to meet his eyes, even as her vision blurred with tears, because he needed to see what he had done, needed to understand the full measure of his destruction. But then something shifted in her, some deep truthfulness demanding acknowledgement, and she heard herself saying in a quieter voice raw with vulnerability, "And the worst of it, the cruelest part, was that I had noticed you long before any of this happened, had watched you at gatherings and admired your intelligence and strength, even though you never looked at me, never saw me among all the debutantes vying for your attention, and I told myself it was foolish to feel anything for someone so far above my reach, someone who seemed carved from ice rather than flesh." And she saw his eyes widen with shock, saw him take an involuntary step toward her as understanding dawned. "So when you condemned me, it was not merely a stranger's judgment, it was the man I had secretly regarded pronouncing me worthless. And that betrayal cut deeper than the scandal itself, deeper than exile, because some foolish part of me had hoped you might one day see me, truly see me, and instead you looked at me with contempt and dismissed me without a second thought." And now she was crying openly, all her careful composure shattered in this frost-rimed garden, while he stood before her looking as though her confession had struck him like a physical blow. "Forgiveness?" she repeated his earlier question, her voice breaking on the word. "I do not know if I can forgive you, Your Grace. I do not know if the damage you inflicted can be repaired, or if trust once so thoroughly destroyed can be rebuilt. And I need time, not days, but perhaps months or longer, to understand what I feel beyond this confusion of anger and pain and something else I dare not name." And she wrapped her arms around herself against the cold and against the vulnerability of having revealed so much. And when he spoke, his voice was hoarse with emotion, as he said, "Take all the time you require. Lady Cordelia, take years if you need them, and I will wait, and I will prove through action rather than words that I see you now, that I understand what I nearly destroyed, and that I will spend however long it takes earning the right to stand in your presence without causing you pain." And they stood in the winter garden surrounded by bare branches and frost, while something fragile and tentative took root between them, something that might with patience and care grow into forgiveness, and perhaps into something neither of them yet dared to name. Spring came to London with a gentleness that felt like benediction, the parks blooming with daffodils and cherry blossoms, while the morning air carried warmth instead of winter's bite. And Cordelia found herself walking in Hyde Park with the Duke on a Tuesday afternoon, when respectable society took the air, their pace measured and proper, with her maid following at a discreet distance, and though to observers they appeared merely cordial, she was acutely aware of every detail, the way his hand hovered near her elbow without quite touching, the careful attention he paid to her words when she spoke of the book she was reading, the small smile that softened his austere features when she made an observation that amused him. The courtship that had begun after their confrontation in the winter garden was unlike anything she had imagined in her girlish dreams before the scandal, for it was built not on poetry and passion, but on the slower foundation of consistent presence, of trust earned through 100 small demonstrations of care, the flowers that arrived without fanfare, the opera box he secured when he learned she loved Mozart, the way he listened when she spoke of her charity work, with the same attention he gave to matters of state, never condescending, always genuinely interested in her thoughts. They spoke of substantive things during their carefully chaperoned meetings, discussed philosophy and politics and literature, and she discovered beneath his cold exterior a mind of remarkable depth and a dry wit that caught her by surprise, while he seemed to treasure every glimpse she offered of her inner life, and she watched as he proved through steady action what words alone could never have conveyed, that he saw her, truly saw her, and valued what he perceived. By summer, when he asked her to walk with him in the Marchioness of Lindsay's garden, where they had first broken through the walls between them, she knew what he intended before he spoke, felt her heart quicken as he led her to the same spot where she had confronted him months earlier, and when he turned to face her, his expression held none of its customary reserve, only vulnerability and a hope he did not try to disguise. "Lady Cordelia," he said quietly, taking her hand in both of his with a gentleness that still surprised her, "I will not offer you pretty speeches or romantic declarations, for we have been honest with each other, and I would not diminish what we have built with artifice. But I will offer you this promise. I will spend my life proving worthy of your trust. I will protect your happiness as fiercely as I once failed to protect your reputation, and I will love you with a devotion that grows deeper with each day. I am granted the privilege of your presence, and if you will consent to marry me, I will count myself the most fortunate of men, not because I deserve such grace, but because you have chosen to bestow it." She saw in his eyes the truth of every word, saw the man who had fought a king for her sake, and then fought harder still to earn her forgiveness, and when she said yes, it was not because she had forgotten the pain, but because she had chosen to trust the transformation she had witnessed. And when he kissed her hand with a reverence that spoke more than passion could have, she felt the last remnants of ice around her heart finally melt. 2 years later, she stood in the garden of Ravenscar Hall, watching their daughter chase butterflies through the roses, while their infant son slept peacefully in his cradle beneath the oak tree. And when the Duke emerged from the house and came to stand beside her, slipping his arm around her waist with the easy affection of long intimacy, she leaned into his embrace and marveled at the journey that had brought them to this moment, from betrayal and exile to this profound contentment, this life they had built together on the foundation of hard-won forgiveness and patient love. Dear listener, perhaps you hear this story and think it impossible that such damage could be repaired, that trust so thoroughly shattered could be made whole, but I tell you that redemption is always possible when met with genuine remorse and sustained effort, that the deepest connections sometimes grow from the most painful beginnings because they are forged in the fire of adversity rather than the ease of circumstances, and that second chances, when honored with humility and cherished with care, can produce something more beautiful than what existed before the breaking. If you carry wounds inflicted by another's judgment or harbor regrets for harm you have caused, know that transformation is possible, that forgiveness can be both granted and earned, and that love built on the bedrock of honesty and proven through the test of time becomes unshakable. May you find the courage to seek redemption when you have erred, and the grace to offer it when you have been wronged, And may you discover, as Cordelia did, that sometimes the greatest gifts come wrapped in the most unlikely packages. And may peace find you in all your days.